Eleanor Whitford had never grown accustomed to silence, though her house was full of it. Cypress Hills stretched wide across the Georgia landscape like a body that had been pinned down, the long oaks bent with age, the cotton fields sighing beneath October wind. Inside the great house, however, silence lingered like damp in the walls. Since her husband's death 2 years prior, the sounds that once steadied her, the ring of boots on the gallery, the slow baritone of his laughter at supper, the authoritative calls drifting out toward the fields, had vanished, leaving only the hush of heavy curtains and the creak of old wood. To Eleanor, the absence had become more unbearable than the presence ever was. Her mind, restless, found ways to fill that void, and those ways had already begun to stir talk that spread beyond the fence lines of Cypress Hill, seeping into pews and parlors like a fever no one dared name aloud. At 29, Eleanor was still considered a beauty. She carried herself with a pale fragility, her dark hair wound tight against her skull, her cheekbones fine as carved glass, her eyes shadowed by the restless nights she did not confess to anyone. In daylight, she dressed herself in gowns of gray silk, her corset laced to the breath, her throat wrapped with strands of pearls that had belonged to her mother. Her beauty, though admired, carried a sharpness that kept people at a distance, and when she smiled at neighbors during church gatherings, the smile never warmed the room. She was known as a lady of refinement, a woman of fortune and breeding, yet even the servants whispered about the odd ways she wandered the halls at night, whispering to herself as though in conversation with unseen companions. Sometimes they claimed they heard the faint splash of water long after midnight, the heavy door of the bathhouse groaning open and shut, though none dared approach. Cypress Hill itself seemed to mirror its mistress's unsettled spirit. The great columns at the front, once white as bone, had taken on the dim gray of mildew. Vines crept brazenly up the sides, and shutters slammed loose in the wind. Eleanor forbade repair. When her overseer suggested painting and mending, she replied coolly that the house did not wish to be tampered with, as though the house itself had spoken through her. The rooms were filled with heavy furniture draped in dust covers, portraits of her husband glaring down from the parlor wall, his eyes forever fixed on her with a judgment she both craved and despised. She left the clocks unwound. She let candles burn themselves down to stubs in the windows, so that any traveler passing Cypress Hill after sundown would see a glow like watchful eyes, never steady, always flickering. On afternoons when the sun pressed too hot, Eleanor often sat on the gallery with a lace fan in one hand and a glass of watered sherry in the other. She would watch the fields in silence, though her gaze seemed not on the workers who bent beneath the cotton, but on some invisible horizon only she could see. Those who passed along the road remarked on how still she looked, like a statue placed at the edge of her own domain. Children from neighboring farms whispered tales about the widow Whitford, claiming she walked among the oaks barefoot at night, whispering charms, her white gown trailing like mist. Grown folk did not encourage such talk, yet when her name arose in polite company, a stiffness always entered the air. It was not what they had seen, but what they suspected. Rumor filled the void like water rushing into a broken levee. Her household staff endured her moods in quiet dread. She might summon the cook late at night, demanding a plate of sugared pears, only to fling it against the wall untouched. She would call for her maid, Harriet, and insist her hair be combed out again and again until her scalp reddened. Yet there were times she softened suddenly, weeping without cause, begging forgiveness from whoever stood nearest, as though she had committed some unspeakable crime they already knew. No one understood her, though all of them feared her. Fear was easier than pity. At the heart of Eleanor's unrest was the bathhouse, a low building set a short distance from the main house, tucked between the willows and the slow green water of the creek. It had been built in her husband's time as a luxury, its copper tub large enough to swallow a body whole, its floor tiled with imported stone that caught the lamplight in amber tones. After his death, Elinor took to it with ritualistic fervor. Each evening she went there alone, though never entirely alone. She required others to prepare the bath, to pour heated water into the tub, to stand ready when she entered. At first it had been Harriet who carried in the buckets, but soon Elinor demanded men, strong men from the quarters, their shoulders glistening with sweat as they lifted and poured. It was said she dismissed Harriet altogether, forbidding women from entering the bathhouse once dusk fell. No explanation was ever given. She only smiled, that strange cold smile, and insisted on her way. The men who attended her rarely spoke of it. They obeyed, their eyes downcast, their hands steady as they lifted water, their silence holding secrets heavier than the buckets themselves. Rumors spread quickly regardless. Some claimed Elinor shed her gown before them without shame, as though daring the world to condemn her. Others said she wept in the tub, her body trembling, her voice breaking as she begged unseen spirits for mercy. A few whispered she was possessed, that her nightly baths were not indulgence but penance, some desperate attempt to cleanse herself of sins unnamed. Whatever truth lay behind the locked door, it was enough to feed gossip that stretched from Cypress Hill to the nearest church pew, where preachers thundered about modesty while their eyes flicked toward the Whitford estate. Elinor herself never addressed the whispers. She carried herself with the calm arrogance of one who knows society cannot touch her, not while her land and fortune shield her. Yet within the privacy of her chamber, cracks showed. She paced the floorboards late at night, muttering prayers half remembered, her hands clenching the pearls at her throat until the string cut into her skin. She spoke aloud to her husband's portrait, sometimes pleading, sometimes raging, as though expecting him to answer from within the painted frame. The servants, moving softly through the hallways, heard these one-sided conversations and exchanged fearful glances, but never dared comment. They had learned that the boundary between Elinor's favor and her fury was thin as spider silk, easily broken. There was one man among the enslaved who watched her closely, though never openly. Josiah, tall and steady-eyed, often carried the buckets to the bathhouse. He did so without question, yet each detail imprinted itself upon him. The tremor in her hand when she dismissed him, the way her lips moved in silence as the water steamed around her, the hollow look in her eyes as if she stared into some abyss only she could see. Josiah kept these observations to himself, but they grew in his mind like seeds, and he understood more keenly than most that Elinor Whitford's strength was a mask. Beneath it lay fragility, a weakness that one day might open into opportunity. As autumn deepened, the atmosphere at Cypress Hill thickened with unease. The air carried the scent of dying leaves, of smoke from distant fires, of something approaching that none could name. Elinor drifted through her days with the fragile grace of a woman poised between sanity and collapse. She hosted no guests, though invitations arrived and piled unanswered. She dismissed the overseer's reports with a wave of her hand, as though cotton and weather meant nothing to her now. Instead, she lingered near the bathhouse even in daylight, standing on the threshold, her face lifted as if listening for some voice within. The house itself seemed to shudder beneath her moods. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to draw her attention, for when her dark eyes fixed upon someone, it was as though she saw straight through them, past flesh into soul, and the sensation was unbearable. Still, society continued to bow before her wealth, neighbors doffing their hats when they passed her carriage, church-goers nodding stiffly as she entered the pew reserved for the Whitford name. Yet after services, whispers buzzed in corners. A woman living alone, indulging in strange habits, surrounding herself with secrecy. Such things could not remain hidden forever. Rumor and scandal are like hounds. Once they have caught the scent, they pursue without mercy. And already, Elinor Whitford could feel the hot breath of those hounds at her heels, though she pretended otherwise. In the long nights, when the bathwater cooled and the candles guttered, She pressed her hands to her face and trembled, whispering to herself in broken fragments, half prayer, half confession. She knew, though she dared not speak it, that the silence of Cypress Hill was no longer empty. It was listening, it was waiting, and in its waiting it promised that her secrets, however tightly she tried to drown them, would one day rise to the surface, slick and undeniable, like a corpse refusing to stay buried beneath the water. The air around Cypress Hill had grown thicker with each passing week, as though the very trees leaned closer to listen. Among the enslaved quarters, whispers traveled more swiftly than wind, each retelling sharpening the edge of fear and suspicion. At night, when the work was done and the weary bodies sank beside smoldering fire pits, voices lowered to murmurs as they spoke of the lady of the house and her strange, unholy habits. They said her bathhouse was not a place for cleansing but for conjuring, a sanctum where water and candlelight concealed darker deeds. No one claimed to know precisely what occurred within, but imagination needed little fuel. It was enough that she summoned men there after nightfall, her pale face glimmering in the lamplight, her commands soft yet impossible to disobey. Children huddled close to their mothers, died as tales unfurled. Some said she wept and spoke to shadows, begging them to wash her sins away. Others insisted she stripped bare without shame, as if daring the Almighty Himself to look upon her and cast judgment. The older ones, who had lived longest under the Whitford name, merely shook their heads and muttered that the mistress was touched, her mind cracked by grief and loneliness. Yet even they watched the bathhouse door with unease when the lamps glowed long into the night, and steam rose like a spirit from the chimney. No matter how hardened or skeptical, none of them denied that the lady had become a creature of rituals, her fragility twisting into something uncanny. Among them, Josiah listened more than he spoke. His tall frame and quiet strength had earned him a certain respect, though he never flaunted it. He carried the buckets often, his arms straining with the weight of water that steamed against the cool night air. He knew the sound of her footsteps on the bathhouse floorboards, the faint hitch in her breathing as she entered the water, the way her voice, when it did break the silence, quivered like glass about to shatter. To others it was rumor, to Josiah it was memory. He had stood within arm's reach as she dismissed him, her eyes glazed with some private torment, her lips trembling as though she whispered to ghosts. He did not know what demons pursued her, but he understood with clarity that the mistress was unraveling, thread by thread. He did not speak of it openly. To do so would be to risk the wrath of not only Elinor, but also the overseer, who tolerated no insolence. Instead, Josiah kept his thoughts tucked deep within, sharing only fragments with Thomas, a broad-shouldered man whose years of labor had hardened him to stone. They spoke cautiously, while mending tools or gathering firewood, their words hidden beneath the clatter of work. Josiah hinted at what he saw, the shaking of her hands, the tears she did not hide, the way she seemed to both command and plead with those who entered the bathhouse. Thomas's eyes narrowed, suspicion sharpening into interest. "A woman who shows her weakness," Thomas muttered once, "is a woman whose hold can be broken." Josiah said nothing then, but the words rooted themselves in his mind. The servants within the main house fared little better. Harriet, once favored, now banished from the bathhouse, carried tales to the quarters of how the mistress screamed at her reflection, throwing combs and brushes against the glass until shards glittered across the floor. The cook confessed in hushed tones that Elinor had demanded a cake be baked at midnight, only to toss it untouched into the fire. Every story was a puzzle piece, and though none of them formed a whole picture, together they painted the image of a woman teetering dangerously on the brink. Fear mingled with fascination. They loathed her cruelty, dreaded her sudden outbursts, yet could not help but wonder what secrets she drowned in the copper tub each night. Elinor herself walked through her days like a woman haunted. By morning she appeared in her silks, pale but composed, greeting the world with cold civility. By afternoon she often drifted aimlessly through the galleries, her fingers brushing the columns as if she were blind. When evening fell, the transformation began. Lamps were lit, buckets hauled, doors barred. Those summoned obeyed, though dread twisted in their bellies. Each step toward the bathhouse felt like a descent into forbidden ground, where the ordinary laws of master and servant shifted into something unspoken and perilous. They never lingered longer than commanded, yet when dismissed, the image of her frail shoulders glistening in lamplight clung to their minds like a stain that could not be washed away. The neighbors, too, began to notice oddities. A planter, passing late on horseback, swore he saw figures moving by torchlight near the creek, though the hour was long past decent. At Sunday service, Eleanor's absence became frequent, explained by vague ailments. When she did appear, she sat rigid in the pew, her eyes unfocused, her lips pressed tight against prayers she could no longer remember. The congregation stole glances, some pitying, others censorious. A lady of wealth might be forgiven eccentricity, but there were limits, and Eleanor was drawing perilously near them. The preacher thundered against sin and indulgence, and though he did not name her, many felt his words directed at the mistress of Cypress Hill. Eleanor seemed not to notice, or perhaps she did, for her hands trembled on her lap throughout the sermon. In the quarters, whispers grew into theories. Some believed she sought to cleanse herself of her late husband's spirit, which lingered in the portraits and hallways. Others swore she bargained with darker forces, trading shame for power. A few, bolder still, suggested that her nightly summons might be used against her. If a mistress revealed her vulnerability before men she considered property, then perhaps those men held a weapon, silent but deadly, in their hands. It was Thomas who spoke this aloud, his voice a low rumble as he leaned close to Josiah. "She thinks she holds the chains," he said, "but chains can cut both ways." Josiah did not answer immediately. He looked toward the great house, its windows aglow like watchful eyes, and felt the weight of possibility settle on his shoulders. It was dangerous to think such thoughts, yet the seed had been planted, and it would not stop growing. Eleanor sensed something too, though she could not have named it. In her fragile mind, the world pressed closer, watching her from every shadow. She scolded Harriet for imagined slights, accused the cook of poisoning her meals, wept before her husband's portrait until her knees bruised against the floor. She feared abandonment, yet drove away those who might comfort her. Each night in the bathhouse became more frantic. Sometimes she laughed, a brittle sound that echoed against the tiles. Other times she sobbed until her voice failed. The men who carried the buckets left quickly, their silence heavier than any confession. They knew she was slipping into madness, yet none could predict where madness might lead, or whom it might consume. Thus the plantation lived in dual silence, the silence of a mistress drowning in her own mind, and the silence of those who watched, waiting. Beneath the oaks, by the dim firelight of the quarters, plans took shape not in bold declarations but in glances, in muttered words, in the shared knowledge that power, once thought unassailable, had begun to crack. And though Eleanor still walked the galleries draped in silks, though she still commanded with icy authority, the truth whispered beneath every breath was that the Lady of Cypress Hill was no longer feared in the same way. She was pitied, doubted, even mocked behind closed doors. Her scandal was no longer a secret but a growing shadow, and every night the lamps of the bathhouse burned, that shadows stretched further, reaching for the day it would engulf her entirely. Eleanor Whitford had once been the sort of woman whose presence commanded a room before she ever opened her mouth. Even after widowhood, even after she withdrew into the strange shadows of her own estate, she still carried with her a residue of grandeur that made people bow their heads in acknowledgment. Yet as the autumn of 1839 dragged on, that grandeur began to slip like a veil fraying at the edges. She attended fewer gatherings, and when she did appear, she seemed almost unrecognizable from the polished lady who had once played hostess at Cypress Hill, with laughter tinkling like silver bells. What remained now was a brittle figure, pale and restless, with eyes that refused to hold still and lips that trembled as though they might betray her at any moment. Those who once whispered their envy now whispered something else entirely, pity laced with scandal, curiosity laced with dread. The first signs of the unraveling were small, almost easy to dismiss. At a dinner hosted by the neighboring Harringtons, Elena arrived late, her hair slightly undone as though she had dressed in haste. Her gown shimmered in the candlelight, yet faint stains marred the silk, darker than wine. Conversation faltered as she swept into the parlor, her smile too wide, her voice pitched just a little too high. She laughed loudly at a joke no one else heard, then fell silent, her gaze fixed on the grandfather clock until the entire room followed her eyes to its ticking hands. When her hostess asked after her health, Elena pressed her pearls so tightly against her throat that her knuckles whitened. "Health," she repeated, then laughed again, brittle and sharp as though mocking the word itself. The evening limped along after that, with polite conversation skimming over the discomfort like oil over water, but the memory of her strange behavior lingered. By the following Sunday, whispers filled the churchyard before the bell even tolled. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks as she entered the pew reserved for the Whitford family. Her gown was immaculate this time, her posture regal, yet something in her face betrayed the tension beneath. Her lips moved with the prayers, but her eyes were distant, unfocused, as though she were reciting words she no longer understood. When the preacher thundered against vanity and the sins of the flesh, Elena's hand twitched violently, knocking her prayer book to the floor. The sound echoed through the chapel, sharper than it should have been, and every head turned. She stooped to retrieve it with a jerky motion, her cheeks flushed, her breath audibly uneven. For the remainder of the service she sat rigid, her spine stiff, as though holding back some eruption of laughter or tears. By the time the congregation spilled into the sunlight, the verdict was already written in their hushed tones. The widow Whitford was not well. Back at Cypress Hill, the mask grew thinner still. The servants endured her sudden rages, her abrupt weeping, her commands that contradicted themselves. One moment she demanded music, insisting that the old pianoforte be played until the keys rattled with age. The next she ordered silence so complete that even the ticking of a clock enraged her. She drifted through the galleries like a restless specter, her bare feet leaving faint tracks on the wooden floors. She spoke to the portraits again, chastising her husband as though he still lingered to hear her, her words a tangled knot of blame and longing. At times she ordered the bath prepared not at night, but in the bright blaze of afternoon, scandalizing those who carried the water. Through the open windows, her laughter floated across the fields, high, strange, and brittle, until even the cotton pickers paused in their work, glancing uneasily toward the great house. Josiah observed all of it with quiet calculation. He carried water when summoned, his eyes lowered, his hands steady, but his mind recorded every detail. He noted how her commands faltered, how her eyes darted as though she feared unseen watchers, how her hands trembled even as she tried to project authority. He saw the cracks in the mask that others only guessed at, and while the rest whispered and speculated, Josiah listened with sharper ears, weighing what each fragment of knowledge might mean. He did not allow himself to pity her, though sometimes, when she wept openly before dismissing him, he felt a pang of something close to it. Yet pity was dangerous, useless. Knowledge, however, could be sharpened into a weapon, and Josiah was careful to gather it piece by piece. Thomas, the man with whom he shared guarded conversations, grew bolder in his thoughts. One night by the fire he leaned close, his voice low enough that only Josiah could hear. "She is slipping," Thomas said. "The mistress is no queen now, only a woman undone. When power breaks, Someone else must take it. Josiah gave no reply, but in the firelight his eyes gleamed with a thought he did not yet dare speak aloud. For now it was enough to wait and to watch. The unraveling of Eleanor Whitford was no longer a matter of if, but when. In society, the rumors sharpened like knives. Ladies who once complimented Eleanor's gowns now whispered of stains and dishevelment. Men who once sought her approval now chuckled over her eccentricities, though never in her presence. Children repeated tales overheard at supper tables. The widow Whitford bathed with spirits, or danced barefoot beneath the oaks, or carried on conversations with the dead. Every exaggeration found fertile ground, because there was truth enough at the root of it. Her mask was slipping, and once a mask begins to slide, the world delights in watching it fall. Still, Eleanor clung desperately to the remnants of her respectability. She continued to send invitations, though fewer were accepted. She forced smiles at neighbors who visited. Even as her hands shook so badly, she spilled tea onto the saucers. She pretended not to hear the whispers that followed her footsteps in town, though the effort of pretending left her exhausted. And always, the bathhouse awaited her at day's end, a sanctuary and a prison both. There she shed the pearls, the silks, the pretense, immersing herself in steaming water as if it might cleanse her of the eyes that followed her every move. But no water could wash away the feeling that her secrets, once guarded, were slipping into the mouths of others, whispered from one to the next like a prayer of condemnation. The silence of Cypress Hill was changing. No longer was it the hush of a grieving widow's estate. Now it was the silence of anticipation, of tension strung too tight. The servants sensed it, the neighbors sensed it, even Eleanor herself sensed it in the tremor of her own hands and the echo of her own brittle laughter. The mask of refinement was cracking, and through the cracks seeped something raw, fragile, and scandalous enough to devour her whole. Night settled over Cypress Hill like a heavy shroud, and with it came the rituals that no longer surprised anyone but still filled the air with dread. Eleanor Whitford grew more dependent on the bathhouse as autumn deepened into chill evenings. Where once it had been a place she entered with calculated dignity, now she stumbled toward it as though drawn by compulsion, clutching her pearls so tightly they left red marks against her throat. The lamps glowed in the windows, casting long streaks across the yard, and the men summoned to haul water obeyed with the same grim silence as always. Yet among them something was shifting, quiet as breath, a knowledge, a recognition that their mistress's power was no longer absolute. Each tremor in her hand, each sudden outburst of laughter or weeping, made her more vulnerable, and the eyes that watched her now were no longer only fearful. They were calculating. Josiah was the first to shape that calculation into something more. He had long been careful, keeping his thoughts hidden beneath an obedient expression. But now, when he walked the dark path carrying buckets beside Thomas, he allowed his words to slip free in the cloak of night. "She ain't strong like she was," he murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. Thomas grunted, shifting his load, the lamplight flickering against the sheen of his sweat. "Strong enough still," Thomas replied, though his voice carried the weight of thought rather than conviction. "But I seen it too, she breakin', piece by piece." They spoke no more, but the silence between them felt like a pact. Inside the bathhouse, Eleanor's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Some nights she demanded the water be poured hotter and hotter, scalding steam filling the room until the men's eyes watered. Other nights she asked for candles to be snuffed out so that she could sit shivering in darkness, whispering prayers that fell into fragments of nonsense. Once Josiah lingered longer than usual, and in that pause he caught her reflection in the mirror. Her pale body hunched forward, her eyes wide and wild, her lips moving in frantic supplication. She looked not like a mistress, but like a penitent soul awaiting damnation. The sight carved itself into his mind. He left quickly, but the image haunted him long after. Word spread quietly through the quarters. They spoke of the mistress's breakdown, each account more vivid than the last. Harriet whispered that Elinor had struck her own face in the glass until blood trickled down her cheek. The cook swore she had seen Elinor dancing barefoot in the gallery at dawn, her gown slipping from her shoulders, her laughter echoing hollow through the pillars. No one knew where truth ended and invention began, but it hardly mattered. Each story reinforced the same certainty. The mistress was unraveling, and her unraveling might one day loosen the grip that bound them all. Thomas pressed Josiah one evening as they mended a broken fence away from watchful ears. "What you seen in there?" he asked. "What you seen when she think no one lookin'?" Josiah hesitated, his jaw tight, then said softly, "I seen a woman scared of her own self, a woman talkin' to shadows. That's a woman who can be broken." Thomas studied him, his dark eyes steady. "Then maybe it time we start thinkin' how to break her." The words hung heavy in the air, dangerous even in whispers, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. Elinor herself seemed unaware of how visible her cracks had become. To her, the world was turning hostile in ways she could not control. She suspected the servants of spying, accused the overseer of betrayal, even doubted the loyalty of the few neighbors who still visited. At a supper she hosted in a desperate attempt to reassert her place in society, she grew agitated when the conversation turned to Scripture. She quoted passages wildly out of context, laughing too loud at her own interpretations. Guests exchanged uneasy glances as she raised a glass in trembling hands and declared, "Purity is a lie. We are all filthy in his eyes." The words shocked the table into silence. Later, whispers spread like wildfire, each guest recounting the scene with relish and disdain. Back at Cypress Hill, Elinor's paranoia deepened. She locked her chamber door at night, yet still paced the floorboards until dawn. She ordered the windows shuttered, claiming the oaks outside hid eavesdroppers who pressed their ears to the glass. Once, she accused Josiah directly of listening to her prayers, her voice sharp with hysteria. He dropped his eyes, muttered apology, and retreated, but inside he felt a new certainty. Her mind was a collapsing house, and he was inside its walls, learning every creak and weakness. The enslaved community began to move differently. They shared looks, exchanged fragments of thought, built an unspoken language of opportunity. The mistress's fragility gave them space to breathe, to imagine, to plan. Thomas spoke more boldly now, suggesting that Elinor's compulsions might be used to distract her, to shift power slowly, invisibly. "She thinks she own us," he said one night by the fire, "but her own mind own her more than we ever could. We use that. We let her madness make her blind." The others listened, their faces lit by flame, their eyes reflecting the first glimmer of something long dormant, hope. Elinor, meanwhile, sank deeper into her private rituals. She spent longer hours in the bath, sometimes emerging at dawn with her skin pale and wrinkled, her eyes hollow. She muttered to herself as she walked the galleries, her fingers trailing along the walls as though feeling for guidance in the dark. She clutched her late husband's portrait to her chest, weeping against the frame until the canvas warped with moisture. The house grew thick with her madness, and even the walls seemed to echo her instability. Servants moved with greater haste, desperate to avoid her gaze, but no one could entirely escape. She was everywhere, fragile and erratic, a storm contained within human form. And still the whispers beyond Cypress Hill multiplied. At church, at markets, in parlors, her name was spoken in lowered voices. Some said she communed with spirits. Others hinted at sins too shameful to describe. A neighbor claimed he heard her screaming in the dead of night, though no storm nor wild animal stirred. Every rumor, true or false, tightened the noose around Elinor's reputation. Yet she remained oblivious, wrapped in her own delusions, convinced that her rituals cleansed her, that her nightly immersions kept her whole. In truth, they dragged her deeper into madness. By late November, the first frost painted the fields silver, and still the lamps in the bathhouse glowed each evening. Josiah and Thomas continued their silent pact, their eyes meeting as they carried the steaming buckets, their thoughts unspoken but aligned. They saw what others did not, that the Lady of Cypress Hill had already begun her fall. All that remained was to decide whether they would merely watch or whether they would guide the collapse, bending it to their will. Elinor bathed in her fragile sanctuary, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering in the shadows, the storm born not of rebellion in arms but of patience, observation, and the weapon of her own unraveling mind. The oaks whispered at night, their branches clawing the sky, and those who listened swore the sound was not wind but voices. Cypress Hill was changing, the balance of power was shifting. And though Elinor Whitford still believed herself mistress of all she surveyed, the truth was already slipping through her trembling fingers. December brought a cruel chill to Georgia, the kind that seeped into bones and lingered long after the fire died. At Cypress Hill, frost covered the fields in brittle lace, and breath came out in pale clouds at dawn. Yet inside the house, the air was heavier than the season could account for. Elinor Whitford no longer pretended at gaiety. Whatever mask of composure she had managed in autumn was gone now, replaced by a raw, disquieting energy that unsettled even the most hardened observer. She drifted through rooms with a shawl clutched around her shoulders, muttering words no one could catch, stopping suddenly as if she heard voices others could not. The grand house that once symbolized refinement now felt like a mausoleum, echoing with her laughter that broke too sharply, her cries that rose without warning. The bathhouse became not merely her habit but her prison. Each evening, no matter how frigid the night, she demanded the buckets carried, the lamps lit. The men obliged, their hands raw from the cold, steam rising into the frosty air as they trudged with the heavy loads. Josiah noticed her urgency deepen with the weather. The colder the world outside grew, the more fiercely she clung to the steaming water, as if submersion might preserve her from disintegration. Yet it did not cleanse her, it revealed her. The sight of her pale, trembling form in the lamplight became almost unbearable, not for its scandal but for the naked madness etched into every gesture. She whispered to the water, pressed her hands against the surface as though listening to its answers, and sometimes sank until only her face remained above, eyes staring wide and glassy. Thomas confided to Josiah after one such night. "She drownin' in her own mind," he said, shaking his head. "One day she won't come back up." Josiah did not argue. He had seen it too, the way Elinor lingered beneath the surface, as though the boundary between life and death beckoned her closer with each passing evening. Yet he also understood that her madness, while terrible, was an opening, and openings had to be used. The enslaved whispered more openly now. They spoke of freedom not in vague dreams but in strategies, in hushed fragments exchanged between chores. Elinor's madness had loosened the overseer's grip as well. His authority seemed less absolute without the mistress's sharp commands to back it. The fields were still tended, the work still done, but an undercurrent of something new pulsed through the quarters, the sense that power could tilt, that the old order was not immutable, and though no one spoke it directly, all eyes turned toward Josiah. He had been closest, had seen more than anyone, and his silence carried weight. He did not boast, did not threaten. He simply observed, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Elinor tried in vain to reclaim control. She summoned a seamstress to sew her new gowns, bright colors that looked garish against her pale skin. She insisted on hosting another supper, though fewer neighbors attended this time. Those who did witnessed a spectacle both pitiable and disturbing. Elinor greeted them with hands that trembled so badly she spilled wine on the carpet. She spoke of visions, of dreams that warned her of betrayal, of shadows at the edge of her land, whispering her name. Her guests smiled politely, shifting in their seats, until she suddenly slammed her fist on the table, shouting, "They think me weak, they think me lost, but I see clearer than any of them." The outburst froze the room. Conversation limped on afterward, but no one missed the desperation in her voice. After the guests departed, Elinor wandered the house in a frenzy, tearing down drapes, overturning vases. The servants watched from corners, too wary to intervene. Finally, she collapsed in the gallery, clutching her husband's portrait to her chest. Her sobs echoed through the halls long into the night, a sound that made even the most hardened hearts uneasy. In the quarters, Thomas gathered a small circle. "Her mind is our weapon," he said, his voice low but steady. "She breaking more each day. We use it or we waste it." The others nodded, though fear still shadowed their faces. Rebellion was a word too dangerous to speak, yet the thought hung in the air unspoken. Josiah remained silent for a long moment, then finally said, "Not yet. Watch, wait. The time will show itself." His calm steadiness soothed them, though it offered no certainty. Eleanor's decline accelerated as Christmas approached. She demanded the bath at strange hours now, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the dead of night. Once she ordered the men to carry buckets while sleet fell, the icy rain soaking through their shirts as steam hissed into the frozen air. Inside, she stripped off her garments with a violence that startled even Josiah. Her body shook uncontrollably, yet she insisted the water be hotter, hotter, until her skin flushed red. She whispered fragments of scripture, twisting the words into strange pleas. At one point she turned to Josiah, eyes wide, and whispered, "Do you hear him? He speaks through the water. He tells me I am cleansed." Josiah lowered his eyes and did not answer, but the words seared themselves into his memory. By now the rumors in town had sharpened to knives. Some said Eleanor had lost her mind entirely. Others claimed she practiced forbidden rites in the bathhouse, consorting with spirits. A few declared openly that Cypress Hill was cursed. The Whitford name, once spoken with respect, now drew smirks and pity. Invitations ceased, visitors dwindled. Eleanor was isolated in every sense, trapped in her crumbling estate with only the enslaved as witnesses to her decay. Yet even in her madness she sensed betrayal. One evening she accused Harriet of spying, slapping her across the face with trembling fury. Another time she cornered Josiah, demanding he swear loyalty to her alone. "They plot against me," she hissed, her nails digging into his arm. "But you will not betray me. Say it." Josiah met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and said softly, "I will not betray." She released him, satisfied, though in truth his words held no allegiance. He had learned the power of speaking just enough, never more. The nights grew colder, the frost thicker, but within the quarters the fire of resolve spread. They did not yet know what form it would take, but they knew the world within Cypress Hill was changing. Eleanor's authority was a crumbling wall, and every day brought new cracks. The bathhouse, once her sanctuary, had become the stage of her undoing. Each ritual, each immersion, was both a cleansing and a drowning, dragging her further from reality. On Christmas Eve, the lamps glowed brighter than usual. Eleanor demanded every candle lit, the bath steaming in brilliant light. She entered with arms raised as if performing a sacrament, her voice ringing with hysterical devotion. "Tonight the water will purify me," she declared. Josiah stood in the shadows, watching as she submerged herself, her body trembling violently beneath the surface. For a terrible moment he thought she would not rise, and he felt the weight of decision press upon him. But she did rise, gasping, laughing, clutching her pearls. The laughter echoed through the chamber, wild and broken. That night, as Josiah walked back with Thomas, their breath fogging in the icy air, Thomas said quietly, "It won't be long now." Josiah did not answer. He lifted his eyes to the frosted branches above, listening to the whisper of the wind, and in his silence lay the truth. The storm was gathering, and Cypress Hill would not stand unchanged much longer. January came with a brittle cold that made the trees groan at night, their branches heavy with ice. Cypress Hill stood shrouded in a silence so dense it seemed almost unnatural, as if the estate itself held its breath. Within its walls, Eleanor Whitford moved like a restless spirit, her gowns trailing dust, her hair increasingly unkempt, her eyes carrying the hollow gleam of someone who had looked too long into the abyss. Her rituals had intensified, no longer contained to the bathhouse alone. At times she demanded the pianoforte be played until the strings snapped, her laughter clashing with the broken notes. Other times she ordered every mirror covered with cloth, insisting they betrayed her secrets to unseen enemies. Servants obeyed, their faces expressionless, but behind their stillness spread an invisible current, a unity born of her unraveling. The bathhouse remained the center of her mania. Each evening, no matter the storm, no matter the hour, water was hauled and fire stoked. Her demands grew harsher, her outbursts more violent. She wept, she raged, she whispered to shadows. She slipped beneath the steaming surface for longer stretches, rising gasping and trembling as if returning from some private war. Sometimes she clutched Josiah's wrist, her nails sharp, whispering, "You hear him too, don't you, the voice in the water? He promises I will not fall." Josiah never replied. He had learned that silence was safer than lies, but his silence carried weight, a patience that even Thomas now recognized as strategy. Thomas pressed harder in their whispered exchanges. "We can't wait forever," he said one bitter night, their breath clouding in the cold as they carried buckets. "Her mind is gone. We let this slip by, it might close again." Josiah answered calmly, "Not yet. Watch her, watch them, the house, the overseer, the land. The time will come." His steadiness unsettled and comforted in equal measure. Thomas wanted action, but even he admitted Josiah saw things others missed. He saw how the overseer grew uneasy, his authority undermined by Eleanor's unpredictability. He saw how neighbors visited less and less, leaving the estate increasingly isolated. And he saw how Eleanor herself, once the pillar that held Cypress Hill together, now teetered on the edge of collapse, dragging the entire structure with her. Outside, whispers swirled into storms. In town, Eleanor's name was spoken with derision. Some swore she had lost her soul. Others claimed she bathed with spirits, or worse, with flesh-end. Blood companions unfit for a lady's company. The rumors sharpened into scandal, and scandal into certainty. Her invitations were ignored. Her presence in church was met with sidelong glances. Children tugged away from her pew. The Whitford name, once untouchable, had become a cautionary tale. And though Eleanor seemed deaf to the gossip, somewhere deep inside she sensed it. Her paranoia grew fangs. She accused Harriet of poisoning her tea, ordered Thomas whipped for lingering too long by the bathhouse door, and struck Josiah across the face when he failed to answer her frantic question quickly enough. Yet each act of cruelty rang hollow, stripped of the authority it once carried. She was mistress only in title now, her madness eroding the fear that had once bound them. One stormy night, lightning cracking across the fields, Eleanor summoned them to the bathhouse at midnight. Rain poured in sheets, soaking their clothes as they hauled steaming water across the yard. Inside, the heat clashed with the storm's chill, creating a suffocating fog. Eleanor stood naked before them, her body pale as bone, her eyes wild. "Tonight," she cried, lifting her arms, "I am reborn." She stepped into the water with a fervor that bordered on violent, splashing so fiercely that steam hissed into the air. She dunked herself under, again and again, emerging gasping, sobbing, laughing. The men stood silent, their faces masks of obedience, but in the shadows their thoughts burned. Josiah's gaze never left her. He saw not only her madness, but her fragility, and in that fragility lay possibility. Later, as the storm still raged, Thomas pulled Josiah aside. "This is it. She can't last. We wait too long. It'll be wasted." Josiah studied him, the thunder rumbling overhead. Finally he said, when the world already believed she lost, "What more we need do? They see her fallen. We just let her fall." Thomas frowned, frustrated by the patience, but he knew Josiah was right. The mistress's collapse was not a matter of if but when. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor's decline quickened. She rarely ate. She wandered the halls at night, candle in hand, speaking to portraits as though they answered. She accused unseen figures of watching her, clawed at her own arms until they bled, then demanded more pearls, more silk, more water. She tried to hold on to refinement, draping herself in gowns, ordering grand meals, but everything came undone in her trembling hands. Once she hosted a supper for no one, commanding the servants to lay a feast across the table. She sat alone at its head, lifting a glass in a trembling toast, whispering, "To those who remain faithful." When the servants cleared it away, she wept so hard the sound carried into the fields. The enslaved moved with quiet certainty now. The overseer's authority was fading, the neighbor's judgment had already condemned the mistress, and the estate itself seemed to creak under the weight of her instability. Small acts of resistance multiplied, chores delayed, tools misplaced, conversations stretched longer. Nothing dramatic, nothing to draw the whip, but everything threaded with a growing confidence. They no longer feared the mistress's wrath, because her wrath no longer held power. Elinor, however, clung desperately to what remained of her dominion. She called Josiah to her chamber late one night, her eyes wild, her hair disheveled. "They plot against me," she whispered, gripping his arm with bruising force. "But you will protect me, say it." Josiah met her gaze, his voice low and even. "I will protect." She released him, trembling with relief, unaware that the words carried no allegiance, only the careful neutrality of a man who knew how to survive. By February's first days, Cypress Hill had become a stage upon which madness and silence played their intertwined roles. The mistress unraveled openly, her scandals whispered far beyond the estate, while within its walls the enslaved watched, waited, and planned. The bathhouse, once her sanctuary, now stood as a monument to her decline. Each immersion dragged her further from the world she sought to control, leaving behind only the hollow echo of authority long since lost. And Josiah, ever watchful, understood what others did not, that sometimes the greatest power lies not in striking the blow, but in waiting for the moment when the enemy destroys themselves. Elinor Whitford was teetering on the edge of that moment, and Cypress Hill, every soul within it, stood poised to feel the tremor of her fall. March came with rains that turned the fields into mud and made the air heavy with rot. Cypress Hill seemed to sag beneath the weight of the season, its once browed columns streaked with water, its shutters rattling in the wind. Within the house, Elinor Whitford wandered like a figure untethered, her silk gown stained, her pearls broken into strings she wore knotted around her wrists. Her eyes had grown fever, bright, darting from shadow to shadow as if every corner hid betrayal. She rarely slept. When she did, her screams pierced the silence, carrying across the quarters until even the children shivered in their sleep. The bathhouse remained her shrine. Every evening she demanded the ritual, no matter the storm. Buckets sloshed as Josiah and the others trudged through rain, the lamps burning in fog, their shadows long and skeletal. Elinor stripped herself without hesitation, her voice rising in frantic hymns as she entered the water. She spoke to unseen companions, laughed at jokes no one heard, wept for sins she could not name. More and more, she stayed beneath the surface longer, her body trembling when she emerged, gasping like a creature dragged from another world. Josiah watched in silence, his face carved from stone, but inside he felt the tremor of inevitability. The mistress was drowning not in water, but in herself. Rumors in town had hardened into scandal. Neighbors no longer spoke her name with pity, but with disdain. They said she was possessed. They said she had turned her estate into a den of sin. Some whispered she bathed naked with the enslaved, others that she consorted with devils in the night. None of them knew the truth, but the truth hardly mattered. In society's eyes, Elinor Whitford was already condemned. Invitations ceased altogether, and when she appeared in church one final time, her hair disheveled, her gown mismatched, the preacher faltered mid-sermon, his voice cracking under the congregation's uneasy gaze. Children giggled. Women turned their faces away. Men shook their heads. She fled before the service ended, her shoes clattering against the wooden floor, and she never returned. At Cypress Hill, the enslaved no longer whispered. They spoke with purpose. Thomas urged bolder steps. She ain't mistress no more. He told the others, she's a ghost wearin' silk. Ghosts can't hold chains. Harriet nodded, her eyes fierce. We been waitin' too long. The wall's already cracked. Push, and they fall. Josiah listened, his silence commanding more than their words. At last he spoke. The world already turned against her. Let her own madness finish what we cannot. When she fall, we rise. His calm voice settled their unease. They did not yet know what form freedom might take, but they knew the hour approached. Eleanor, in her unraveling, sensed betrayal everywhere. She accused Josiah of conspiring against her, then the next moment clutched him like a confessor, begging him never to leave her side. "You are faithful," she whispered one night, her nails biting into his skin. "You see me when others mock. You will carry me through." Josiah lowered his eyes and murmured, "I see you," though what he saw was not salvation but the ruins of a woman consumed by her own obsessions. The rains worsened. Nights grew suffocating with damp. The bathhouse smelled of mildew, its lamps hissing in the fog. One stormy night, Eleanor demanded every candle be lit, the chamber blazing like a cathedral. She stood naked before the water, her skin ghostly pale, her pearls tangled in her hair. "Tonight I am cleansed forever," she cried, her voice echoing against the walls. She plunged beneath the surface, thrashing, clawing, staying down so long that even Thomas, hardened though he was, shifted uneasily. Josiah did not move. He watched, steady, as bubbles rose and silence deepened. At last she burst upward, gasping, laughing, clutching her pearls until they snapped and scattered across the wet floor. The sound of them rolling echoed like the tolling of bells. Eleanor's laughter followed, shrill and broken, filling the chamber until even the storm seemed quiet beside it. Afterward she collapsed against the edge of the tub, her breath ragged, her eyes, glassy and wild, fixed on Josiah. "They will never take me," she whispered, "never, for I am already pure." Her words trembled into silence. Josiah turned and left without answering. Outside, the storm lashed the land, but within him something settled, heavy and certain. Days later, Eleanor vanished from her own routines. The bathhouse lay dark for the first time in months. She retreated into her chamber, refusing food, refusing company. Servants heard her pacing, muttering, sobbing. Sometimes she shrieked at unseen figures. Sometimes she sang lullabies to no one. By the week's end, she emerged thin, pale, her silk gown hanging from her frame. She staggered to the bathhouse one last time, demanding the water, but her strength faltered. Josiah and Thomas carried the buckets in silence, knowing they watched an ending. Eleanor entered the water slowly, her body trembling. She whispered prayers, sank beneath the surface, and this time did not rise quickly. Seconds stretched into eternity. Josiah stepped forward, his eyes steady, but he did not reach for her. The others watched, breath held, until finally she floated upward, her eyes closed, her lips blue. They pulled her from the water, laid her on the floor, but no breath came. The mistress of Cypress Hill had drowned not in rebellion nor violence, but in the depths of her own unraveling. Her pearls scattered around her like broken promises, her silk clinging like a shroud. Silence filled the bathhouse, heavy and final. Word spread swiftly. In town, the scandal became a conclusion. Eleanor Whitford had succumbed to her madness, consumed by the very rituals that once defined her refinement. Neighbors shook their heads, some with pity, most with scorn. "A fitting end," they said. At Cypress Hill, however, the enslaved felt something deeper, a tremor of release. The chain that had bound them was gone, not cut by revolt, but shattered by the weight of its own corruption. Josiah stood outside that night, the rain finally easing, the sky streaked with pale stars. Thomas approached, his voice low, "It's done." Josiah nodded. He looked toward the fields, toward the horizon. "It's beginnin'," he said, for with the fall of Eleanor Whitford, Cypress Hill no longer belonged to the ghosts of its past. It belonged to those who had endured, who had watched, who had waited. And though the future was uncertain, One truth was clear. The mistress who bathed herself in obsession had drowned in it at last, leaving behind only the echo of scandal and the whisper of freedom rising through the oaks.